The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
3 years on from Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the conflict continues, both at home and abroad now, with splintering support and a new US administration threatening to upend progress. So, is this finally Europe's wake-up call? And can it still count on the United States for support? And is the continent actually ready to step up and provide its own collective defence? We pose those questions and more to Dmytro Kuleba. He spent 4 years working in President Zelenskyy's administration as Minister for Foreign Affairs and played a key role in international negotiations until his resignation in September 2024. Dmytro Kuleba, real pleasure to see you today, and thank you very much indeed for joining CNBC in this conversation. Ever since the US election last year, there have been grave concerns about what the administration of Donald Trump would mean for the Russo-Ukrainian war. There's been dramatic events in the last couple of days with the Trump overtures to Russia and the Trump criticism of Volodymyr Zelenskyy. What do you make of recent developments?
Well, we clearly see that President Trump wants a quick solution. President Putin pretends that he is helpful in making it happen. And President Zelenskyy and the European Union are trying to slow the process down and to turn it into a more regular diplomatic conversation. This is the framework, and the outcome of it depends on the character, the stamina, and the muscle that every side will be able to demonstrate in this very challenging undertaking.
Does Vladimir Putin want a deal?
He wants to avoid upsetting Donald Trump. That's his strategy. He does not want a deal. He does not want a stripe of Ukrainian land. He does not want Ukraine in NATO. He wants no Ukraine. He wants Ukraine not to exist. And there should be no illusions about that. Just one example of how Russia approaches this negotiation. So there was this meeting in Riyadh between Marco Rubio and other US officials and Sergei Lavrov and his Russian colleagues. US delegation went out of the room and delivered very kind of exciting, encouraging remarks about how good cooperation with Russia will be and how good it is to talk to them. And they made a constructive move by agreeing to re-establish the sizes of the embassies in both countries as they had been before the invasion began. But the tone of Lavrov and his colleague was completely different. In fact, Lavrov publicly said that Russia did not attack Ukrainian energy facilities, which presumably was the part of one of the ideas that two delegations entertained to prohibit attacks for both sides on energy facilities. He went out publicly and said, "We are not attacking, so there is nothing for us. There is nothing that we should do to stop it." You can already see very different tones and approaches on both sides. And the fact that the United States delegation seems so excited is kind of a bit weird. I think they need to slow down because they have to understand the side they're working with.
But President Zelenskyy has hit back and said, look, don't buy the Russian line. Do not live in this disinformation bubble that you're being fed by the Russians. But one thing we know about the top American diplomats and about the president, Mr. Trump himself, they are very smart people who probably know full well what is going on the ground in Ukraine. They have extraordinary intelligence. They have knowledge from the Ukrainian partners so far. Why do you think that Mr. Trump is saying things like Ukraine started the war, Ukraine shouldn't have gone this far, they should have done a deal, when actually they know the reality of the situation? What do you think is going on in the mindset?
Because he believes that he can make a deal with Putin and impose it on Ukraine and Europe. This is why he has adopted the narrative that, in his view, probably is intended to incentivize Putin or to motivate him to reciprocate with constructive steps. But I don't think President Trump is sensitive to accusations of spreading Russian disinformation. I believe he is pretty firm in what he believes in, and I don't think it's going to work, just to tell him that you are wrong. Everything we know about him is that if he never recognizes his mistakes. And it will be an issue. The question is, he looked around, he thought, Europe is not a partner to make a deal. Ukraine will have to impose what I tell them to do. So the only side that I really have to make a deal with is Russia. And he's wrong in this assessment, because whatever kind of deal he may strike with Putin, there will be two issues. One, you cannot enforce a deal without Ukraine and Europe. And second, Putin does not trust Trump for a very simple reason, because he does not know whether Trump's promises will hold after he's gone. And he does not need a temporary solution. He knows that the best guarantee for him that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO is the non-existence of Ukraine. In his conviction, the West always betrayed him. And unfortunately, there are some pundits in the West who kind of reinforce this message and tell the stories of how bad the West was and towards Russia, and how the West brought all of this on our heads, which is not true, but that's a different story. So there are some very, very big hurdles ahead of Trump.
Do you think Donald Trump cares what happens to Ukraine? He just wants a deal. He just wants to stop financing the war. Obviously, he's talked about a huge number, which has been disputed. But do you think he actually cares what happens to Ukraine? Do you think he cares about the ramifications for Europe and for the world?
I don't think he cares. Okay, let me put it even simpler. I believe he doesn't care. I believe he does not care about any single country in the world except the United States. The only what really makes him feel kind of concerned is that Ukraine does not turn into his Afghanistan. That Ukraine does not, that his plan does not collapses in a way that will expose his weakness to the whole world, that he failed to achieve, because he has zero tolerance to failures. We know him, and this is the issue. So it's not about telling him how good Ukraine is and how it deserves his support. Doesn't make sense, because that's not how he thinks.
But I've been privileged to come to Ukraine over the last decade, and one thing that various leaderships, whether it's Mr. Yatsenyuk, Mr. Poroshenko, Mr. Zelenskyy, yourself and others, have said is Ukraine's failure will be Europe's failure, and that will be dangerous for the entire continent, and actually there will be grave ramifications. Even if, as Mr. Trump said, there is a great big ocean between us, a failure of Europe, more war on the European continent, attacks on the Baltics, or whatever it may well be next as well. This is a danger for the US, though, even if it is not on its own shores.
Well, there will be two detrimental consequences for the world and the United States if Ukraine loses. The first one is that countries like China, like Iran, like North Korea, like anyone who wants to change borders by force or to impose their will on a neighbor, will see that Russia's strategy paid off. Yes, it's tough. Yes, it's costly, but in the end, you get the price. So if Ukraine loses and Russia wins, and of course it may be framed in different terms, as if no one lost and no one won, but you cannot make people not understand what is happening in real. So if Ukraine loses all of these countries, they will clearly understand that they should follow in Russia's footprints. Second, they will see that the West is incapable of defending what it stands for. And for the United States, it means multiplication of conflicts that it will have to be involved in across the globe.
And that means potentially trans-Pacific problems with China, which has its eye on Taiwan.
Listen, the first thing that will happen if Ukraine loses the war, there will be a war. Putin will attack EU country. I don't know which one, I don't know how, but he will do that for a very simple reason.
Well, it won't be Poland because they have an enormous army.
Poland.
Will it be the more vulnerable northern flank, those Baltic nations?
What if it will be just a couple of long-range drones hitting energy facilities or ammunition depots in the United Kingdom? Why do you need an army today to wage a war?
You think Vladimir Putin could attack an EU country or the United Kingdom? Why would he do that?
Because he's already doing that. Look at the Baltics. Look at interfering. Look at how he interferes his planes interfere in the airspace. Look at meddling in elections. Look at cyber attacks. Look at statements coming from German intelligence openly saying that Russia is preparing an army that will be ready to confront NATO by 2028. Mm-hmm. He will attack Europe for a very simple reason, because if they lost in Ukraine, they will lose there as well.
But throughout the history of the Cold War, whether you were Sweden, which was ostensibly neutral but was working with NATO on defence, whether you are one of those NATO countries as well, there's always been disinformation, there's always been some form of cyber attacks, there's been obviously a concern and probing of Russian jets into European airspace. Why would it be more dramatic if Putin won the Ukraine war? Why would he do that?
For two reasons. The first one is because you don't have the United States anymore. It seems this America is not going to fight for Europe. And second, Putin has nothing to lose. Putin, you have to understand, Putin will be fighting wars for the rest of his life. Because this mode of functioning, this mode of exercising power is very convenient to him. Country is under even tougher control than it was before. Close associates are making billions on defense contracts. He is the leader who is restoring the greatness of Russia. Putin does not care for the number of square kilometers that will belong to Russia after his rule. What he cares is how he will be described in history books.
But even if there was regime change in Russia, a lot of people in the West think it's going to be some friendly liberal government. That's a complete misreading of the situation, isn't it?
The truth is that no one can tell you who will come after Putin at this point. It's 100% speculation, unfounded speculation on what is going to happen after Putin. It's just impossible to imagine at this point.
Before we move on to a couple of the issues you've raised there as well, I just want to go back to what the Americans have already given to the Russians. And it seems to the outside observer that the Russian annexations of the 4 oblasts plus Crimea, it looks like the Americans have almost said that is how it is, that is the land lost as well. And in terms of the Ukraine future as well, the Americans appear to have said it won't be within NATO as well. They've already given away an awful lot, haven't they?
Yeah, for an outsider, it all looks like grave diplomatic mistakes. I mean, this is like huge flaws in negotiating strategy. But as you rightly said, they're not dumb people. They're smart, they're experienced, they have their agenda, they are on a certain mission. So I tried to come to terms with this approach, and the best I could get is that this is Trump's way of encouraging Putin to reciprocate on big things. Mm-hmm. The problem is that Putin has a number of issues unrelated to the war in Ukraine that he can give away to Trump as a message of encouragement in return. And Zelenskyy doesn't. All Ukraine has is related only to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. For example, Putin released a US citizen, right? Trump welcomed him in the White House, like strong man, finally. Biden failed, I did it, good. He has plenty of prisoners in Russia. He can release them one by one.
So Putin is playing Trump beautifully, as far as you can see.
Putin is playing Trump beautifully by making concessions unrelated to the war in Ukraine while continuing his offensives on the ground and missile and drones attacks.
But I remember reading an article of yours, I think it was relatively recent, that said that Mr. Putin and Mr. Zelensky almost were playing the same game. They both had to get the ear of Donald Trump and keep the ear of Donald Trump and say that they were ready for peace talks and not so much flatter Donald Trump, but make out that they were the close ally working in the same direction as Donald Trump as well. Has Volodymyr Zelensky failed and actually made a big mistake in the last 24 hours by criticizing the US president?
He did not fail because he had no other choice to make. He lost Trump's ear after putting on hold Trump's proposal for a deal on minerals and rejecting the idea of elections. And he rejected the idea. Actually, he was, in my view, Zelensky was had been more open to the idea of elections before Trump and Putin started speaking in one voice about the need to hold elections, which is natural. Like it's a survival instinct. When you see the United Trump and Putin demanding elections from you, you kind of have reason to suspect that something is going wrong.
I've been in Kyiv on the last two presidential election nights. I was at Poroshenko's victory party. I was at Zelensky's victory party as well. I believe that democracy, albeit flawed, and there are problems in Ukraine as well, is pretty much alive and well. I don't remember seeing that same kind of democracy on my trips to Russia as well. Why do you think Trump called Zelensky a dictator, but I don't recall him ever saying that Putin is a dictator?
Well, that question must be addressed to President Trump, but the answer is the one that I already gave, because Zelensky upset Trump by rejecting him.
But he upset Trump during Trump 45, during his first administration, when he wouldn't, I think it was, dig the dirt on the Biden family and try to combine that with a military deal.
Well, in his first administration, Trump started with a standoff with Ukraine. He was very upset about Ukraine, and with bear hugging Putin in Helsinki. We all remember their meeting, and he ended up selling javelins, missiles to Ukraine, and fighting and slamming sanctions on Nord Stream 2, which was the most important business project for Putin. So, as grim as the current situation may look like, there is time ahead of us, and we have to be cold-headed and patient and very resolved. But as you rightly recalled my remarks, the fight for President Trump's ear at this stage was won by Putin. But Zelensky, to his defense, he could not act differently. He could not have accepted this deal, and because it was a bad deal for Ukraine.
What does the best deal for Ukraine look like now, given everything we've said already as well? Because EU membership is potentially still on the cards. NATO membership is potentially off the cards. Are there any possibilities of meaningful security guarantees?
The best deal for Ukraine is the UK, Norway, and the European Union wake up and double down on their own defense. And because when they do that, Ukraine will also benefit, and we will be able to receive more military support from them. I want to be very clear. There are many people, and there is a lot of talk about security guarantees, but real security guarantee is when someone tells you, in case you are attacked, I'm going to fight for you. Everything short of that is not a security guarantee. It's called security assurance or increased military assistance. There is no conversation today on the prospect of any other countries fighting for Ukraine. The only chance for that is if Ukraine is admitted in NATO. And I would not frame the conversation as if NATO membership is off the table, because NATO membership was not really on the table even under Biden administration. It's just that for the sake of political politeness, no one was speaking out loud about it.
The truth is, NATO membership was never on the table for Ukraine.
NATO membership in foreseeable future was never on the table. It was always a long-term objective, open door policy, but it was not something that was being discussed in in terms of specific deadlines.
Does Ukraine need foreign troops in Ukraine, peacekeepers? I know the British are talking about some form of air cover, what have you. Ukraine has built up an enormous army, which wasn't in existence in 2014 when the military was gutted by the Yanukovych regime as well. Ukraine has an enormous army which has done incredibly heroic things to thwart the aspirations of one of the biggest nuclear powers on the planet. Does Ukraine actually need foreign troops in Ukraine as part of a peace deal?
The reality is this, you train our troops, but you learn from our troops. This is what is happening. Every army in Europe is trying to be as closely connected to the Ukrainian army as possible. Every producer of weapons in Europe and in America, by the way, wants to be as closely connected to Ukraine as possible, because this is where real combat knowledge is. And this is what you don't have. And having fancy army on the parade or on the Ministry of Defense files is one thing. Having a combat army is a completely different thing. Today, Ukraine has the strongest and the most efficient army in Europe. Whether you like it or not, this is the truth, because it knows how to fight. It has its own problems and shortcomings, but they are uncomparable to the advantages and lessons it learned. So, getting to your question, we can win this war without foreign troops on the ground.
Win the war or hold back the Russians, because it seems very, very difficult for either side to make meaningful progress away from the current front lines.
No one in Ukraine has illusions that anyone is going to fight for us, with us, or alongside with us, either to hold Russians back or to expel them from Ukraine. We know it's in our hands, and this is the best deal the West ever got from a country at war. Everywhere else, you were going into that country, and your people, your soldiers were dying for someone else. Ukraine made a very decent deal. It said, we're going to do this job ourselves. Just give us everything we need to do that. So we can fight without foreign troops on the ground, but we cannot fight without Western weapons on the ground.
And Western weapons, mostly, I guess, means US weaponry. Well, I mean, you can contest that as well if you like, but if the US does pull military assistance, will Ukraine lose the war?
That's
Russian boots in Kyiv.
This question is more complicated than it seems. So basically, if you carefully look at what kind of leverages President Trump really has on Ukraine, it's weapons, it's macro-financial assistance, it's intelligence sharing, and one element which is linked to weapons, but it needs to be singled out, it's Patriot missiles. Because if Ukraine does not receive Patriot missiles, interceptors, in sufficient quantities, Russian missiles and drones are going to race the country to the ground. This is a big issue. And there are very little places in the world where you can get this from. Intelligence sharing is another thing that is almost significantly controlled or possessed controlled by the United States. With all my respect to MI5, MI6, and other intelligence bodies, but Americans kind of have a hold on that. So this is another difficult thing that you can hardly replace. But when it comes to the rest of the range of weaponry and macro-financial assistance, Europe can do that.
But without that intelligence, without those defensive capabilities as well, which could well be withdrawn if Trump is trying to push for a deal with Putin, which, as you say, has other factors that don't include Ukraine within as well, is there a very real possibility that this extraordinary defense that Ukraine has mounted over the last 3 years will crumble?
Well, we are on the edge of a clickbait headline here, right? If I give the wrong answer, but what is going to happen if Trump will not be sending weapons and sharing intelligence, and Europe will not be able to increase its supplies to Ukraine, is that the Russians will be all around Ukraine. Yes, we will bleed to death. We will not give up fighting, but it will be impossible to stop them because they will simply outnumber us and outshoot us. The issue of timing here is fundamental, though. Are we going to see like a spillover of Russian forces within a week all over Ukraine? No, this is not going to happen. But are we going to see faster advancement of Russian forces in Ukraine? Yes, this is going to happen. So again, the question of timing and how this time will be used by Ukraine and its partners is crucial.
There is another source of information, misinformation, that says Europe let this happen by misreading the importance of Ukraine as being part of the sphere of domain of Putin, misread the situation and wanted the cheap energy from Russia and wanted that economic relationship, so actually made other missteps along the line as well. People have talked about the Merkel administration and the mistakes it made as well. That aside, do you think actually Europe has been sleepwalking into this crisis, not over the last 4 or 5 years, but actually throughout this century?
Well, there is nothing easier in diplomacy than to accuse Europe and the United Nations of sleepwalking. These are the two very soft targets to attack. But we have to be fair, and the assessment of Europe would consist of two parts. First, yes, this war is happening because Europe always looked at Ukraine through the prism of Russia. And so did the United States, by the way. President Obama designated Ukraine as Russia's zone of influence. And this was kind of, this led to Putin's growing appetite. But even outside of Ukraine, the way Europe and the United States handled Syria was shameful, embarrassing. And I tell you that if Syria had played out differently, there would have been no war in Ukraine. Putin would not dare. But he saw that, you know, the West announces the red lines, he crosses them, and nothing happens.
I was at the last G8 meeting in Northern Ireland, and Putin and Obama were walking along, and I remember asking a specific question to President Obama: "Are you making progress on Syria?" And he smiled, and yes, we're making great progress. But clearly, they never did.
But that's the whole point. Everything the West did towards countries where Putin wanted to dominate was convincing him that the West allows him to do that. In 2008, the war in Georgia, he invaded Georgia. A couple of months later, after the invasion, President Obama announced a reset in relations with Moscow. In fact, what we're seeing today with the pace of Trump's re-engagement, rapprochement with Moscow, it's the second reset. I don't see any difference between what Barack Obama did in 2008 and what Trump is doing now in 2025. I understand that people would not fancy this comparison, but this is the reality.
But Europe can't have that reset, can it? Europe can't go back to the cozy days of a tight economic relationship with Russia.
Now they can't, because they realized that Russia poses a threat to them as well. This instinct, this very deep feeling, is already widespread among Europe's elites. The problem that these elites are facing is that this point doesn't sell among their voters.
And they are fiscally challenged. And
oh, come on, listen. Europe enjoys the highest credit ratings in the world.
So why did Boris Pistorius not get the money he wanted from Christian Lindner? Why are the Italians spending sub 2%, the Spanish spending sub 2%?
Because they have to
the
go
British
to the market.
are struggling to get to 2.5%.
Because they have to go to the market, and they have to go to Belgium and take 300 billions of Russian frozen assets. I mean, I am sick of the conversations of how poor Europe is.
Yeah.
Europe is the richest part of the world taken altogether.
So
It has the highest financial reputation in the world, and when they had to save Europe from the pandemic, they went to the market. They saved Europe's economy.
So when you have those conversations, or had them with Herr Scholz and his government, with Pedro Sanchez and his government, with Giorgia Meloni and her government as well, it was just excuses and platitudes you got back?
Well, these governments are kind of friendly to Ukraine. They're trying to do their best, but on finances, yes, we were always told that, guys, we want to help you, but we have our limits in terms of money. The thing is, if you went to the markets to save Europe from the pandemic, but you're not going to the markets to save Europe from the threat of physical destruction, then you were wrong in your analysis of what good European politics is. But the problem is again, I would like to emphasize that I see among political leaders in Europe the understanding that Russia is a threat. But this point does not sell to their voters. If you try to be elected and you build your campaign around the point that you have to spend, if you vote for me, I will spend more money on producing weapons and strengthening our defense because Russia is likely to attack us. Are you going to win elections in Britain these days? Probably not.
But you've already said Russia could be ready to fight a war against an EU nation successfully within the next 2, 3, 4 years as well. Is this a period where Europe is going to take and seize the opportunity to rearm and to get serious about its own defense? Because again, the other factor that Europe has to get serious about, apparently, is that it's not going to be defended by the United States potentially.
Yeah, not potentially. It's not, I mean, guys, face the reality. It's not going to be defended by the United States.
So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and Article 4 / Article 5, not worth the paper it's written on.
Well, the Article 5, I'm sorry to say it, Article 5 does not read, we shall all fight for you. It says we shall do everything we can to help you, and that is subject to different interpretations. Listen, the whole trust in NATO is not built on a treaty or an article of a treaty. The whole trust in NATO is built on the promise of the United States to fight for Europe. And if that promise is questioned, the treaty can stay, the organization can stay, but it's not going to work. This is the reality, and people understand that. I mean, people involved in the process. Speak to the Baltics. Speak to Finland. Speak to Poles. Do you think Poles spend almost 5% of their GDP on defense simply because they want to meet the NATO to exceed their NATO threshold? No, because they feel that they will be at war, that the risk of being at war, fighting against a stronger enemy is real. It's not hypothetical. And I tell you that with today's technologies, no country in Western Europe can feel safe. Long-range drones is the weapon that can reach you. And you can believe in your air defense, but here someone from a country at war, every air defense has holes in it.
So do you think, you've said the elite get it, but you've said it doesn't go well with the voters, and you've poured cold water on the argument that's out there that we can't afford it. Europe's a very rich place. What do you think will happen?
Well, this is the biggest question I have. I mean, the summit that Macron convened in Paris is encouraging. The messages coming from the European Commission are encouraging. But with Europe, there is always a doubt how commitment will be transformed into action, or whether. So it remains to be seen. I believe we have about 6 months to go. If Europe does not begin to act now and fails to increase military deliveries to Ukraine and macro-financial assistance to Ukraine, because Trump clearly is not going to do that in the coming months, then we will begin to run out of weapons and money, and that will be very difficult to handle.
And then Putin will set his sights on an EU nation?
Yes, I mean, I'm saying this not because I'm Ukrainian. I'm just trying to tell you what is going to happen to you if we fail. And every time the Russian official will be coming to the stage and saying, don't listen to anyone fantasizing about us potentially attacking you in Western Europe or in NATO, please, you must all remember two things. First, they were saying exactly the same things about Ukraine. They were telling everyone that they were not going to invade, that it was absurd, it was American Russophobia, it was a lie. And second, read the document that the ultimatum that Putin put through on the table in December 2021, which demanded the retreat of NATO from beyond the line of 1997. So effectively from all Central European countries. He said it. It's there. It's on the paper. It was hidden in the store by Western diplomats because they did not want to highlight that Putin has claims for NATO territory. Because the whole war had to be framed only as Ukraine and Russia. But it's there. It's online. Just Google it.
You talked about the war being framed Ukraine versus Russia, and we've talked a lot about the US role and the European role as well. Why do you think, despite all of your incredible efforts when you were foreign minister and others as well, the global south didn't buy in to more support for Ukraine?
Because Russia and China are more appealing partners for global south than the West. Because the West has been losing global south for decades and learned very few lessons on how to stop this from happening.
So a global architecture post-Second World War based on US dominance, based on the dollar, based on US institutions, that era is over for large parts of the world.
Global order based on values, which led to everything that you just mentioned, is convulsing.
And China is winning that war?
Not yet. China is strengthening its positions, but the best thing that happened to the West over the last decade, over the last 5 years, is that the non-West still struggles to unite. There are too many conflicting interests among them. So they already feel strong enough not to be aligned with the West and not to listen to the requests or demands coming from the West, but they're still far away from genuinely uniting against the West. So now, since I'm not a foreign minister, I can be more straight on this. So G7 is strong because all of its members are united around one goal of defending the order they built. Because rules-based order was built by the West. This is the truth. Now, with the arrival of President Trump, it remains to be seen how G7 is going to survive his second presidency. But if you look at BRICS, which was created as an opposite to G7 to rewrite the rules, there is no unity in sight.
No.
And this what keeps them away from winning the war. They are not united. They have very divergent interests. India and China, Saudi Arabia and China. Just look around. There are plenty of conflicts inside of the group. So they are, in a nutshell, they are already strong not to listen to the West, but they are still too weak to actually defeat the West.
And is the Trump administration going to add to that diminishment of the rules-based system, of the values-based system, of multilateralism?
Yeah, but values are not in fashion anymore. And the United States have always been, in fact, the staunchest, China will be the staunchest defender of multilateralism now, because China needs stability. And for them, multilateralism where they play one of the key roles as member of the permanent member of the UN Security Council. For them, it's a tool of slowly but steadily advancing their interests.
So the US cedes a position, China fills the void.
Yeah, exactly. It happens exactly this way everywhere in the world. If the EU does not come in Ukraine, Russia will come in. If NATO does not come in Ukraine, Russia will come in. If the United States do not come somewhere, China comes in.
So this is huge, because then the US, by having its borders closer to home, by putting America first, by making America great again at the expense of potentially friendly partners, actually creates more opportunity for China across the entire world, across the West, across the South, across the emerging markets, absolutely everywhere. So
Absolutely.
The US is playing a very dangerous game by retrenching geopolitically.
Yes, but I don't think they frame it this way for themselves. I believe that this is we live in the world of very nationalist, strong powers. Look at China, look at India, look at Russia, look at Saudi Arabia, look at South Africa, look at the United States, look at European countries. Nationalism is on the rise. And the arrival of Trump simply manifested that the West is moving on the same trajectory as the rest of the world.
So that nationalism, and I do want to just have a couple of questions about EU, if I may, and then we'll get near to the end. The EU membership is still on the cards over the medium term for Ukraine. A lot of hurdles to jump there as well. But the EU itself is at danger of fragmentation because of that nationalism.
Ukraine will not become a member of the EU until the European Union reforms itself. As much as I wish it wasn't the case, but the old players or the stakeholders in the EU realize that the arrival of Ukraine, which seems to be inevitable now, the arrival of Western Balkans and Moldova will significantly change the balance of power inside of the European Union. And they learned their lessons with Poland and Hungary and countries like Slovakia, because basically the initial deal was the West was said, we will admit you into the club, we will help you to clean off the dust and become normal and democratic and prosperous, and in return you will follow the rules. The West delivered, but then the moment these newcomers felt strong enough, they kind of started to fail listening. And this is how conflicts with the previous Polish governments were possible. This is what Orban is playing now. Orban built Hungary on Western money, but now he is the most anti-Western politician in Europe. So elites learned the lesson. They do not want to repeat this mistake again with the newcomers, and they want to introduce safeguards to remain in charge of the Union. So, and this is where the whole conversation in the EU about the need to reform the decision-making processes and interinstitutional relationship is coming from. So, which is good because it signals that enlargement is inevitable and they are preparing for it. But it's bad because Europe is very good at lecturing others how to do reforms, but it kind of struggles itself with that.
So it has to come from Paris, it has to come from a new Berlin government.
Yeah.
It has to come from Rome.
Absolutely, from key European capitals have to imagine how enlarged the European Union is going to function.
Let me ask you just a few closing questions, if I may. How has the war changed Ukraine? How has it changed the Ukrainian people? As I say, I know the country, I've been to the country, incredibly tough, resilient people as well. How do you think things have changed for the people of Ukraine, this attrition over the last 3 years?
In terms of building a nation, of course, this war made decisive input. we resolved so many internal disputes simply by fighting as one against the enemy, which is a good thing. The bad thing is that many people died in this war, and this is not the price that you would be willing to pay to strengthen your identity and to sort out issues of internal character. Secondly, we are all traumatized. For generations to come, we will all be traumatized by this war. Children, elderly, men, women. Our society is going through some very painful moments. Divorces, birth rates, psychological traumas. It's everywhere, on every corner. Personally, what I hate the most about Putin in Russia is that we have a generation of children who do not know how it feels to live without the war. Even like my kids, my son is 18 and my daughter is 13, they live in Kiev. We all live in Kiev. And they don't remember life without war anymore. And a son of my civil wife, Svetlana, he's 11, and he doesn't remember life without war at all. So this is really that I find very difficult to forgive.
A nation has found its identity, but at an enormous cost in terms of deaths, injuries, and psychological trauma as well. That obviously isn't a price worth paying, but it's something that has left the Ukrainian people at this stage, after 3 years of war, resolved to see it through, or actually they just want this over and done with as quickly as possible?
Well, humans are very complicated creatures. People overwhelmingly want the war to end, just for this nightmare to end. But at the same time, they keep fighting. This is the reality. I want this war to end, but I realize one thing, that we will all be gone if we lose. I mean, if I live in Ukraine and in Kiev, and Russians come to Kiev, I know that will be the end of my life. They will not forgive me or people like me for fighting against them. And millions of Ukrainians understand what is at stake in this war. So we complain a lot on the hardships we endure, on the war, on the politicians, on poor management in the army, but we keep fighting. And this is the kind of equilibrium that has been built in Ukraine. Are we tired? Absolutely. We are we are exhausted. But do we understand that giving up, what kind of consequences we will have to face if we give up? Yes. And that kind of gives energy to keep going.
Final question. How do you cope with that trauma personally?
I talk to dogs. Yes. I smoke cigars and I'm working on a sheep farm. Because I want, after all of this is over, I want to retreat to the countryside and run a sheep farm. And by the way, I started following one British farmer recently to learn from his Instagram.
You just want a simple future.
Yeah, that's all I want. I think we've been through too many things to be seeking something even more challenging or thrilling or motivating. I want Ukraine to win, and the dream of victory, the dream of peace, of me living with my kids in Ukraine, enjoying life, reading books, is really what keeps me afloat.
Dmytro Kuleba, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.